Before you learned to read, before you understood what a grade meant, or why a bell commanded you, you were enrolled in a world that was not the world. For 18 years, the system was designed so you could not fall far enough to stay down. Teachers intervened, grades warned you, someone was always coming. The day that ended, nobody told you it had. It had the texture of reality, the weight of consequence, a hierarchy as elaborate and serious as any kingdom. But it was held up, carefully, deliberately, every failure cushioned, every fall anticipated, every consequence dialed to a frequency a developing mind could survive. A scaffold exists for one reason, to hold a structure while it learns to hold itself, and then, by design, it comes down. The moment it does, you discover something the scaffold could never tell you while it was standing. What you were being held against was not a wall, it was the open air. These are not warnings, they are coordinates for people who have already stepped outside and are learning to read the terrain. The scaffold protected you from your own consequences, but the first thing it concealed was far more fundamental. It concealed the nature of the rules themselves. The ghost in the architecture. No safety net. The safety net disappears the moment you graduate. The scaffold had a contract with you. Show up, follow the system, demonstrate effort. And the system would structure your progress, mark your milestones, and catch you when you fell. What the contract didn't say, what no one thought to mention, was that it was a closed agreement, valid only within the walls of the institution, binding on no one outside them. Outside, there is no intervention architecture, no mechanism that reaches down when things begin to slide. A person can drift, quietly, slowly, convincingly, for years, and the world will not send a signal, not because the world is indifferent, but because the world was never structured around your development the way the scaffold was. The scaffold also gave you a calendar, midterm, finals, next year, graduation. You always knew where you stood in the timeline. Progress was automatic, built into the architecture. Step far enough into the open air and you discover that the default, in the absence of structure you build yourself, is not forward motion. It is stillness dressed as time passing. The people who navigate the wild most fluently are not the most gifted or the most credentialed. They are the ones who understood early that no external clock would tick for them, and so they built one, internal, personal, invisible to everyone else, and answerable only to themselves. But the deepest distortion the scaffold left wasn't about time, it was about merit, about who the system decided was worth watching and who it quietly wrote off. And what it got wrong about that will take you a moment to sit with. No A+ for effort. There is no A+ for effort outside this building. The scaffold ran on a specific kind of intelligence, the capacity to follow a prescribed system, perform within defined parameters, and return the expected answer to the expected question. That intelligence is real, and it is not the only kind that matters. You knew the ones who didn't have it, or wouldn't use it. The ones the institution worried about in quiet conversations, handed back marked down work with notes about potential, and then you saw them again, a decade outside the scaffold, and something didn't add up. They were building things, leading people, moving through uncertainty with a fluency the scaffold had never tested for and never rewarded, while those of us who had earned every mark, who had never once colored outside the defined lines, were still standing at the edge of the open field, waiting for the next instruction. The scaffold called this a character issue. The wild recognized it as training. The research on long-term outcomes has been consistent. The traits the scaffold most rewarded were not the traits the wild most valued. The children who pushed back, who refused the performance, who failed and kept walking, were already practicing for a world where failure is data, not verdict. They were already learning to make decisions without a rubric. They were already comfortable in rooms where nobody was coming to grade the outcome. The meritocracy the scaffold described, where the most diligent rise and effort is returned with equity, is a closed system. It functions within its own walls. The moment you step outside, the currency changes entirely, and the exchange rate favors people the institution undervalued. Knowing the currency has changed is the beginning. Understanding how institutions use it, and how to move through them without becoming owned by them, is something the scaffold never once addressed. Hard to make friends. Nobody tells you how hard it becomes to make friends. There is a grief that nobody names when the scaffold comes down, not the grief of lost structure, though that is real. The grief of no longer being witnessed. In the scaffold, your progress was seen. A teacher recognized effort. A grade confirmed presence. A ceremony marked arrival. Someone somewhere was registering the fact that you were trying. In the open air, you can run towards something extraordinary for years. And no external authority will mark your progress. No system will register the accumulation of your private discipline. No ceremony will separate the year you grew in silence from the year you merely survived. Self-governance is, in its essence, the act of choosing to move forward when nothing outside you requires it. And the loneliness of that, the sustained invisibility of it, is something the scaffold never prepared you for, because the scaffold was always watching. The wild watches nothing. The wild simply responds to what you do. In the scaffold, connection was frictionless. Proximity created belonging. Outside it, belonging requires construction. Repeated, deliberate, sometimes awkward contact, across schedules and distances, and the particular exhaustion of adult life. The people who navigate the wild without collapsing are rarely the ones who mastered it alone. They are the ones who built small, honest structures of mutual witness out of the unwatched air. You are allowed to find this hard. The loneliness of self-governance is not a character flaw. It is the predictable consequence of being raised inside a structure that did the watching for you. But before you build, there is one more thing the scaffold handed you, invisible, weightless, and heavier than anything else it left behind, the need to be approved of. Approval is a trap. Competence in the wild frequently goes unseen. The scaffold was a social environment before it was an academic one, and in social environments, approval was the most reliable currency on offer. It opened doors, it softened friction, it turned the daily experience of confinement into something navigable. The trap is that the strategy outlived the environment that made it rational. In adult life, the same reflex, everything filtered through the question of how it will be received, produces someone who cannot hold a position under pressure, who cannot say the difficult thing, enforce the necessary boundary, or walk away from something that has stopped serving them, not because they lack conviction, because conviction was never what the scaffold rewarded. A boundary is not aggression, it is information about how you operate, and the discomfort of those who push against it is one of the most honest signals the wild ever sends you about who belongs in it, with you. The people worth keeping will adjust. The ones who resist were never comfortable with you, only comfortable with the version of you that had no limits. The scaffold trained you to maintain that version. The wild invites you to retire it. And once that reflex finally quiets, Something appears in the silence it leaves behind. Not an answer, not a map. Something harder than both of those. Something the scaffold spent years making sure you would never have to face, alone. Popularity, the currency school made feel essential, is overrated. The scaffold was, at its core, a system for finding right answers, and it was very good at that. It trained a particular kind of mind, thorough, careful, averse to error, patient with the process of elimination. The wild does not have an answer key. It has consequences. Every major decision the open air asks of you is a choice between different taxes. The high growth path taxes your stability. The stable path taxes your ambition. The relationship taxes the life you didn't choose alongside it. There is no penalty-free option, and the person looking for one will look forever. People conditioned by the scaffold freeze here, not from cowardice, but from training. They were taught that a downside meant a wrong answer. In the wild, a downside means a real choice, and a real choice is the only kind that leads anywhere. The skill the wild actually rewards is not certainty. It is the capacity to look at imperfect options, choose the trade-off you can sustain, and move without waiting to feel ready. Because the feeling of readiness, the sensation the scaffold trained you to expect before acting, is not a feature of the wild. It is a feature of controlled environments with known outcomes. What the wild has instead is something the scaffold could not manufacture, the consequence of your own first move. And that is where we have been heading. This entire conversation, this entire walk out past the tree line, toward the moment that cannot be prepared for, only taken. Nobody's coming. Nobody is coming. Every person who has ever walked out of a scaffold and into the wild has stood in this moment, the moment when the structure behind them is no longer close enough to cast a shadow, and the terrain ahead offers nothing to hold on to, except the fact that they are standing in it. The scaffold left you with many things, a particular way of measuring worth, a set of reflexes tuned for managed environments, a relationship with authority that assumes someone else holds the map. What it did not leave you, could not leave you, was the first mark, the thing you make when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed, and the ground underfoot is entirely your own responsibility. Not the right move, not the perfect first step, just the mark that transforms the blank ground into a place. You have been. Everyone you have ever admired for their clarity, their self-possession, their ease in rooms with no answer key. They did not find it in a manual. They did not receive it from an institution. They made their first mark. And then another. And learn, Ned, slowly, to read the landscape they were creating. The scaffold is behind you. The rules it enforced were real within its walls, and they are no longer the walls you live inside. Most people spend their lives waiting for the scaffold to return in a new form. A boss who finally sees them, an institution that honors the effort they brought to it, a system that makes the path clear enough to follow without risk. They are waiting for something that was always temporary, and temporary by design. You are not waiting for the scaffold. You are standing in the territory it could never map. In the only place where what you are actually capable of, stripped of rubrics and safety nets and pre-approved versions of your future, finally has room to reveal itself. The wild is not waiting for you to be ready. It is simply waiting. The open air, not whether you are ready, not whether the conditions are right. The scaffold shaped the question. The wild is where you find out whether you were, always the answer. Not whether you are ready, not whether the conditions are right. The scaffold shaped the question. The wild is where you find out whether you were always the answer